Today I'm talking about Simone de Beauvoir's article Pyrrhus Cineas. Um, I really like this text a lot. I think it's really rich, so we'll probably do two parts here. Um, when I first was learning uh, existentialism as an undergraduate, the role that Beauvoir played in the movement was kind of minimized. It was a lot of insinuation, if not outright claiming, that Beauvoir is basically um, Sartre's novel writing girlfriend or something like that, right? However, as I read and had various teachers and encounters with other colleagues, I came to really see Beauvoir as a thinker in her own right and as actually a major influence on Sartre that we wouldn't have being in nothingness and so on without the Beauvoir's sort of formative role in Sartre's own intellectual development. So I view Beauvoir now much more strongly as really a major innovator in existentialism and a important philosopher in her own right. Of course, I think there's a strong case to be made that The Second Sex is perhaps the most influential book to come out of existentialism, even over Being in Nothingness, I think. The way that it was adapted into the feminist movement and just widely moved sort of cultural criticism and things like that forward, beyond the confines of philosophy, where it still is an important text. I think that case could pretty easily, I think, be made. There's also somewhat of a Beauvoir sort of renaissance going on right now. There's a lot more widespread interest in her work. There's a really good biography, sort of an intellectual, philosophical biography by Kate Kirkpatrick called Becoming Beauvoir that was just out recently. It's very good. I encourage people to read it, especially if you're interested in Beauvoir's life and her intellectual development. And relationship with that intellectual community of the time and that kind of thing. So that's Becoming Beauvoir by Kate Kirkpatrick. It's out from Bloomsbury, so very good. Talking about Pyrrhus Cineas, the version that I am looking at here is in Philosophical Writings. This is a series out by the University of Illinois Press. Margaret Simmons, and I think this one has several editors. Mary Beth Temmerman and Mary Beth Mader are also editors. The series, this general Simone de Beauvoir series, there's a collection of feminist writings, of political writings. There's an interesting volume that has a play, The Useless Mouths, and other literary writings. Are collected in those. They're all in very, very good translations. There's a lot of care and thought that has gone into this series. So they're very well done. Pyrrhus Cineas was a work that is not really widely available in English or not widely known in English until more recently. People have been paying more attention to it. And my understanding, sort of biographically, is that Beauvoir was not keen on writing this text. She had to be encouraged somewhat, or so the story goes. But I'm glad that she was so encouraged and produced this text that I think is really, really rich. So I'll see, we'll probably get through part one, but there's a section at the end of part one on the situation. I want to take some time and talk a little bit about the situation. So we may not completely finish part one in this first video. I might save or talk a bit about the situation and expand on that, right? That's a very important existentialist concept. Beauvoir really, I think, builds a good sort of concept, the situation, right? So we need to pay some attention to that. The first thing, I think, just diving into the text and The first section is very short and is definitely not the standard philosophical essay or treatise. Beauvoir was very keen to present herself as a writer, a literary writer. More so, her image was more sort of crafted in that vein rather than as a philosopher who was writing these texts. So immediately we start with a text that has a little bit more literary feel, but it also throws back to the origins of Western philosophy in Plato and in the dialogue form, right? So we have, much like a Platonic dialogue, we have a framing. Plutarch tells us that one day Pyrrhus was devising a project of conquests, and then we get this dialogue between Pyrrhus and Cineas. So one thing that is important symbolically here is the choice of Pyrrhus. This is where we get the term a Pyrrhic victory. And a Pyrrhic victory is a victory, but it's won at such a high cost that the value of the victory is brought into question. So Pyrrhus goes into battle, loses a tremendous number of soldiers, wins the battle, but then in hindsight, his losses are so great that, well, it's dubious now. Was this really worth it? Was the gain that was won by this loss really, strategically advantageous? So there's a element of absurdity and tragedy in the figure of Pyrrhus, right? That is very important for the points that Beauvoir wants to make about human projects. And how we involve ourselves in certain things, but also establish the terms and establish the scope and the aims of those projects in an important way, right? So the other important thing is that Cineas seems wise, she says, but Cineas also questions Pyrrhus's project. So in Beauvoir, particularly in existentialism more broadly, our relationship with others are really important. And it is our relationship with others that sets certain sort of limits on our freedom. We get values from other people a lot. When we're young, Beauvoir will talk in The Ethics of Ambiguity about you kind of take your parents' values for granted. They're like manna from heaven, like a built-in part of the universe or whatever. But eventually you start to question, and they become suspicious. So Cineas performs this role of bringing into question the project that Pyrrhus is thinking about to just continue conquest. He says that I'm going to, conquer. First we'll go through Greece, and then Africa, and then Asia Minor, Arabia, and on and on and on. So Pyrrhus has this grand vision of conquest. And Cineas is asking, well, what for? Why do all that? And why do it if you're just going to turn around and come back at the end? Why go out whenever you just are going to come back home? Why not just stay home, basically? This is a really important idea, this idea of putting the project into question, and particularly that it's the other Cineas that makes Pyrrhus's own project into a problem. Because before, Pyrrhus is just asserting, this is what I'm going to do. Whereas when it's drawn into question, he now has to think about justifying it. How do I actually now ground this project? This is a big issue that the existentialists are interested in, because they're denying that there's these outside sources of justification, right? No external force is going to come to you and pat you on the back and say, oh, good job. Another person might do that, but it's not going to be some magic law of the universe or a rule of physics or God. We'll get to the section on God here in a little bit, but there's not going to be something carved in stone by an omnipotent being that tells you that you're doing the right thing. you have to be responsible for sort of grounding and justifying your own project. So Pyrrhus is put into this spot in the beginning, right? And Beauvoir starts to sketch a little bit, right? And you get a flavor of that kind of existential absurdism. Between Pyrrhus and Cineas, the dialogue starts over with no end. And in the very beginning of the text, Beauvoir is going to talk about Camus and his absurd character Meursault in The Stranger. So there you get another sense of the sort of intellectual community and the mutual influence that Beauvoir is having and has had on Beauvoir there. The Pyrrhus and Cineas, the dialogue starts over like Sisyphus with his rock. It's an ongoing project. One of the issues that Pyrrhus is going to face is that there's no end. It's not like he's conquered Greece and then was satisfied. No, there was another project and another project. And even when he finishes conquering the world, there's still that he has to sort of return home. There's still the return project. So while we're alive, Camus says our rock is our thing. We have some project to do, something, some rock that's occupying our time, whether it's going to school or working a job or dealing with a family matter or an artistic project or whatever the case, may be. There's no sort of end. I think another important thing about Beauvoir's essay here, and this becomes more clear when you move into part one, which is called Candide's Garden. There's a much more obvious and purposeful ethical voice in Beauvoir. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, hints at an ethics. There's a lot of ethical implications in Being and Nothingness, and at the end of Being and Nothingness, Sartre says, well, there's all this ethics stuff, but now's not the time. That's it for another work. And he has notebooks toward an ethics and ethical writings, especially sort of ethical political writings. But from the get-go, right, Beauvoir is much more earnestly pursuing sort of an existentialist ethics. And I think this is something that Jonathan Weber makes pretty clear in Rethinking Existentialism. I think that's a fair part of his analysis in that book as well. The very beginning of part one talks about how there's a boy who's crying because his concierge's son had died. But after a while, his parents gets mad about it, and they say, well, that boy wasn't your brother. What are you so upset? The child dried his tears, but that was a dangerous thing to teach. Unless to cry over a little boy who is a stranger, so be it. But, Beauvoir says, why cry over one's brother? See, as soon as the parents reject the boy's feeling for the stranger, that puts him into the situation of being in question, right? And they're offering him an alternative. They're saying, well, it's not your brother, the implication is you could cry this way, but if it was your brother, right? Don't cry for a stranger, but if it's your brother, okay, then you can cry. Well, the boy's just been told no, that his feeling is illegitimate, and so his immediate question is, why cry for your brother? The question of justification, why value these things, right, reemerges. Why my brother, but not the stranger? And notice Beauvoir says right away that this is a dangerous thing to teach, to not care about strangers, right? To not care about strangers. And she uses various examples of people in what is for her writing in France, and for us, maybe if you're in the United States or in Great Britain, sort of a far-flung place, somewhere removed from you, like India or China. But of course, people in the United States, people in Great Britain or wherever, do care about people in India and China and things like that. So she's going to talk about this tension a little bit between care for the stranger and care for people that are close to you. And what grounds those projects, I think, for Beauvoir is ultimately going to be a similar thing. Your involvement with and commitment to those projects. Now, there becomes a problem where you're not really committed if you're just kind of paying lip service to it, if you're just like, oh yes, the terrible famine in China, oh, that awful tsunami that happened, or whatever. But insofar as you're active and you're doing things as part of your life project, it's not just empty words, but you're putting actions behind it. Getting involved and donating or working for a nonprofit or organizing in some way to ship goods about, or of course like actually going there, of course, rearranging your life project around it. But I don't think it needs to go so far. Right. So she says, if I go within myself, I look at those inert streets with astonishment, saying, but what does it matter to me? All this is nothing to me. I find myself indifferent, peaceful. But what has changed? Asked the sedentary petit bourgeois in September 1940, World War II, right? People resting in France on their laurels, sort of not taking the threat of Nazi advance seriously, and then they are invaded and occupied for 4 years, right? Ask the sedentary, not doing anything, comfortable, middle-class, petit bourgeois, in September 1940, sitting in the midst of his belongings. We will still eat the same steaks. The changes only existed outside. What did they concern him? So the problem here is of viewing yourself as unconnected from the world. One of the reasons why you don't care for the stranger is because the stranger doesn't concern you, doesn't have anything to do with you, where the brother allegedly concerns you. This person, now notice, because of their privilege and their class situation, they don't worry about the Nazi occupation. They're not threatened by it in any way, right? So they are going to eat the same steaks and so on. If I myself were only a thing, nothing indeed would concern me. If I withdraw into myself, the other is also closed for me. The inert existence of things is separation and solitude. So here, you're seeing that distinction between the in itself and the for itself again crop up in Beauvoir. That the in itself, the inert thing, it's not connected to the world. It's not present for the other. The other is closed to it, and there's not much to be done. It doesn't concern anything. But the in itself also is not involved in projects. As soon as you invest in some project as a for itself, as a being who is involved in future-oriented projects, who has a past that affects its decisions, and that is kind of informing the present moment, opening different possibilities for it. As soon as you're in that position, you're now involved with sort of other people, right? And you can't sort of collapse everything down into the in itself, right? This is that decompression of being again. There's no coincidence between the for itself and its object. This is what now she starts to develop. Only that in which I recognize my being is mine, and I can only recognize it where it is engaged. In order for an object to belong to me, it must have been founded by me. It is totally mine only if I found it in its totality. The only reality that it belongs entirely to me, therefore, is my act. Even a work fashioned out of materials that are not mine escapes me in certain ways. So I really only have one complete possession in the world, or something that comes entirely from me, which is my act. Other things can be shaped by me, but not in their totality. So I don't sort of like own them completely. I have a part in them, and they reflect me, and they reflect others to me to others, and that kind of thing. But they're not totally mine. But my action is. And so my action is what grounds me. What is mine, she says, is therefore first what I do. But as soon as I have done it, the object goes and separates itself from me. It escapes me. So this is the temporal progression, right? Once I commit my act, it takes on the appearance of the object, it fades into the past, it now becomes a fact of history, and there's nothing more that can be done to it. I can now act only in the face of that, right? So that is the difficulty of having to live in time, in the present. That's what makes me so anxious about the future. One thing that makes me anxious about the future. Once I commit an act, commit myself to one possibility, the choice is made, and it takes on that objective quality of an object. But, here's the upshot of that open future. She says our relationship with the world is not decided from the onset. It is we who decide, but we don't arbitrarily just decide anything. What I surpass is always my past, and the object such as it is exists within my past, right? The future envelops the past. The former cannot build itself without the latter. So I have to make a choice. The world is not completely decided from the outset. There are possibilities, but I have to make decisions about them, right? The beginning part here in Candide's Garden is working out some of just the very basic existentialist ideas that we can see repeated, not just in Beauvoir and in several other of her works. We'll talk about the ethics of ambiguity in a different series of videos that I'm planning now, and you'll see some of this stuff going on there. She also references Sartre in the ethics of ambiguity, so we'll see in Being and Nothingness some of this material also being worked through in different ways. So the world has this openness. It's not just determined. I have to make decisions, but I don't make decisions arbitrarily because I'm making them with this past in mind. I have a certain trajectory, and I'm a particular person at a particular moment in time with a particular life trajectory. The painting that Van Gogh paints is still a Van Gogh. It's still related to him, right? If he would decide to paint in a style of someone else, it would still be a Van Gogh imitating someone else, right? I mean, it's still connected to him. So here's where the title of this section comes up. That's why Candide's advice is superfluous. It's always my garden that I will cultivate. I am enclosed within it until death, because that garden comes from mine from the moment I cultivate it. So this idea goes back, in the history of, again, here's the ethical political dimension that is creeping up. This idea that when I invest my labor into something, it makes it mine. It appropriates it to me. Now, Beauvoir is taking a more radical position here that, in fact, out in the world, when you're dealing with independent objects, nothing becomes completely yours because it's touched by other people, histories, places, and things. You can't just appropriate objects to yourself totally. It's not possible. But you are your acts. Your acts involve sort of all of your being. Everything that could be said to be you is involved in the act. And so the act is the thing that you found and is yours. And so the work that you're doing, cultivating your garden, your life, your projects, is yours totally, because it's the only thing you have that really flows from your own being and your own existence. And it involves you, and you're committed to it in sort of all of your being until the day you die. It's not finished. It's not a closed totality. It's not an everything all the time, right now, completely finished in this moment. But you'll constantly have to work on it. That's the element of the absurd, that it's always out there into the future and that you're going to continue to work on it. But until you die, that work is yours. You're going to keep doing it, right? So when we use this language of totality in this context, it's not like a complete totality that's all closed in on itself. It's a totality just in the sense that everything that is you, even as it's moving forward and is incomplete, that everything that is you is committed and involved in the foundation of the act, right? And again, it's not going to be completed then because the future is open. And even if there is a sense in which I say, well, that project, that particular thing I was working on is now complete, fades into the past with the appearance of an object. But my life opens now into a new project. There's another possibility. I say, okay, so what's next? Like Pyrrhus. You know? So Candide is trying to search for this closed totality. She says, we see that one can assign no dimension to the garden in which Candide wants to enclose me. It is not drawn out in advance. It is I who choose its location and its limits. Right? So there's no fixed limit predetermined by my project, or predetermined for me and into which my project must fit. I mean, here's a good example of Beauvoir's sort of anti-essentialism. There's no fixed or set thing that you have to be or have to do. You are determining the scope and the breadth and reach of your projects. That's based on decisions that you do. So back to the child who's crying over the other, over the stranger. Why care about the stranger and not the brother? Or why care about the stranger and your brother? Or why just care, why any of these things? Because they come down to sort of choices that we make and what we are choosing to invest ourselves in, right? There's not a magic or a good or a purely logical external reason that comes from some sort of transcendental non-human source that would justify choosing our brother. It's not a law, a scientific law of biology that, because of evolution, I care more for my brother than for strangers or anything like that. You might be more inclined to care for your brother, but that could be explained through any number of things. Evolution, just proximity, you just see them more often or something like that. But none of those things determine you to care more for your brother. You can, through reflection, through the expansion of your moral imagination, care for the others. But you have to decide that the others matter to you, right? They matter because they've already decided they matter, of course, to themselves and the existence of people in the world and the way that they view it. Their subjective feeling is an objective fact of the world. Those people have those values and experiences and they care about their life. Beauvoir's going to get into that more. And we'll talk more in depth about that in the Ethics of Ambiguity. So that basically takes us through the introductory parts and through Candide's Garden, where the kind of general thrust of this essay will play out. So I'm going to stop there, and then in the next video, which this looks like maybe it will be 3 parts, so sorry, I got a little excited about Simone de Beauvoir's text here. It's really good. This is one of my favorite pieces, probably, in philosophy. Full disclosure, I guess. We'll pick up with the section still in part 1. It's on page 95 of that philosophical writings text, The Instant. So we'll pick up there next.